We are continuing our walk through the Gospel of Luke, and we are up to the one story in all of the Gospels about when Jesus was a boy, which actually leaves about a 30-year gap between the birth narratives and his public ministry. And this is the one story we have. Now, this was intolerable for many people, and so in around the 6th century, they started writing other stories of Jesus's boyhood, which are really fantastic. I'll read one in a second. And I get the instinct. Jesus was incredible. So where did he come from? What was he like as a 5-year-old? What were his parents like? What was his upbringing like? I watched recently the David Beckham biographical series on Netflix, which is great, self-indulgent, but great from David's perspective. And there you learn about his father, who was a perfectionist and made him kick the ball again and again and again. And then he became a perfectionist himself and studied the ball so hard and became great in so many ways. We want to know people's backstories, what made them who they were. That's what makes this story so important and so helpful. But what's so interesting about it is that it is extraordinarily ordinary. And you see this more clearly when you see some of the made-up stories. These are all made up, okay? Don't hear me saying these are true. These are all made up. Here's one from the infancy gospel of Thomas, right? The child Jesus was 5 years old. Then, having taken some soft clay from the mud, he formed 12 sparrows from it. But it was the Sabbath when he did these things, and many children were with him. Joseph went and rebuked him. Why are you doing these things on the Sabbath? But Jesus clapped his hands, and ordering the birds with a shout in front of them all, he said, "Go, take flight like living beings." And the sparrows, taking flight, went away squawking. 5-year-old Jesus making birds from clay. That's exactly what I would do if I was 5 and I was Jesus, right? It's kind of stories. There's more stories about him cursing people and them dying, which aren't as children-friendly, and him raising people from the dead. People trying to picture back from the miracles Jesus did into his boyhood. Imagine if you were 5 and you could do whatever you wanted. But the one story we have, in fact, tells us nothing of the sort. In fact, says the exact opposite. Jesus was, in fact, just a boy. He just had a really ordinary childhood. There was nothing to write home about necessarily. That's what this story teaches us very profoundly and deeply. So let's just nut into that quickly. 3 things. First is this. Jesus had a normal childhood, friends. He had a normal childhood. This story from Luke's account reads a little bit like the movie Home Alone. You know, the movie where there's a big family. They all try to get to the airport. So many of them, one gets left behind. That's what happens here. There's a big family. Every year, Jesus, his whole family goes to Jerusalem to celebrate the Passover. It's their big annual road trip in the summer, that kind of vibe. All the aunties and uncles, cousins, nieces and nephews, they're all in the entourage, moving together to Jerusalem. And so they go back after having done all the business of the festival, and they come back, and Mary and Joseph assume that Jesus is with Auntie Jessie or Uncle Sam somewhere back, or playing with the cousins at the back with the camels or something like that. And they move back on the way home, and it takes them a day to realize that Jesus is not there, which is an amazing moment of their parenting. Incredible stuff. And then frantically, they go all the way back to Jerusalem and spend 3 days looking for him. 3 days. And they finally find him. And they say, what is the deal with this? Son, your father and I have been anxiously searching for you. I love everything about this. First of all, Jesus, the perfect child, Son of God, sinless, made his parents anxious. I don't know if you've ever felt anxious about your child as a parent, but here is the one great stamp that anxiety is just how it goes, friends. If Mary and Joseph get anxious about Jesus, then perhaps it's okay and normal and fine for us to worry about our kids. In fact, I think this story is the great stamp on just the normal nature of family life, perhaps even its hallowing, its holiness. That if Jesus could just come and go on the annual road trip and be with his parents and his cousins and their family, then perhaps it is all good work. Nothing of it is to be thought little of or belittled. Raising small children is a remarkable, normal, and great thing. That's what we get from this narrative. It's a beautiful affirmation of the normal nature of human life. Jesus does obey them in the end. He says at the end of the story, so he does obey the fourth commandment. But also raises the question of anxiety in parenthood. I think perhaps anxiety and the anxiety of parents is one of the greatest and most troublesome parts of being a parent. It's our over-anxious responses at times to our kids that can lead our parenting down the wrong path. What we see here is an example of right anxiety. My child is missing. I should find them. But sometimes we can be overly anxious about the wrong things. And if this is at the center of the normalcy of parenting, anxiety, then we need to work out how to handle ourselves. And to know in ourselves when we are growing overly anxious and handle ourselves to best love and tend our children. The other really interesting thing here is, and this is in the whole chapter, second chapter of Luke, Jesus' parents do everything by the book in terms of a Jewish family. Every year at the Passover, every year, 8 days he gets circumcised, purification rites, everything's by the book. There's a picture in which Jesus is growing up in a normal family, but that family has the rhythms of the Jewish nation, of the Jewish religion, of Israel. And a beautiful picture of the fact that we can't control everything about our kids. We can't tell them what to believe. But we can lay into them rhythms, spiritual rhythms, that allow them to find the path of the faith that we want to give to them. And giving them those habits of faith is the great gift we give to them in the normalcy of our parenting life. So friends, Jesus had a normal parenthood. And childhood. And secondly, he therefore grew up and increased in wisdom. Which is to say, Jesus didn't get to skip ahead. He didn't get given the cheat codes. He wasn't miraculously just tall one day, nor was he miraculously wise one day. He had to slowly walk the path of growth like all of us. That's the last verse of the reading. Jesus grew in wisdom and stature, in favor with God and man. When they find Jesus, he's in the temple asking questions. He wants to know more. He wants to understand more. So he's asking the teachers in the temple the best sources of knowledge he can find. He intentionally stayed behind in Jerusalem. He chose to. That's what the text says. He stayed there to grow. Because that's what Jesus had to do. He wasn't born with all the knowledge and with all the wisdom. It had to grow in him. It's like the great carol Once in Royal David City says, for he is our childhood's pattern. Day by day like us he grew. He was little, weak and helpless. Tears and smiles like us he knew. He had to walk the entire path. He had to grow in understanding. But the carol says it's right as well. It's not that we are his childhood's pattern, but he is ours. Jesus is the true child. Growing up in perfection. Growing, yes, in stature, in height, and in wisdom day by day, but the way it perfectly could or should happen in us, but hasn't. Jesus is the great divine do-over of childhood and of human life, walking the path perfectly, step by step, as that growth happened into full maturity. We see not just Jesus grow up, we see us grow up, or us as we could have been or should be. Jesus grows into the person we are and will one day be. He walks all the stages of human life perfectly to make up for our lack. But the other thing we see here is a great picture of our own spiritual growth. Jesus is our pattern. The path of spiritual growth has no cheat codes. If Jesus didn't have them, then neither do you. Wisdom accumulates slowly over years. The right habits with time. There is no simple way beyond the course of growth. It's just day by day and slog. But perhaps it also takes the voracious appetite Jesus had to want to grow, to develop in wisdom and knowledge, as he sits there with the temple teachers growing. There is both an encouragement and a spur for us in this. Growth is slow, but do you want to grow? Jesus was devoted to the Old Testament, to the weird complexity of the prophets and the writings. That was his Bible. That's what he wanted to know fully and deeply and finally. And the encouragement is for us to devote ourselves to God's word in the same way. To grow up as Jesus grew up slowly. But thirdly and finally, there is something here which marks Jesus as fundamentally different. Jesus knew from the beginning who he was. And you see this in his response to his parents, who are asking for an explanation. Why are you doing this? Where were you? Didn't you know we were searching for you? Jesus says, why were you searching for me? Didn't you know I had to be in my Father's house? Jesus says, why did you go to the bakery first? Or the accommodation, or down by the river where I was playing? Why'd you go to the back or the front? Didn't you know? You should have known. I'd be here. I'd be here in my Father's house. Here's where you should have come first. You could have saved 3 days' work. Jesus, as a 12-year-old, knows who he is. He knows God is his Father. He knows he is God's Son. He knows he is the Son of God, with a unique connection to his Father. There is nothing else in his childhood which is different or interesting other than that. This is the source of his answers to the teachers that amazed many. Not that he just was really smart or got there quicker than others, but because he had a relationship with his Father no one else had ever had. He was a child prodigy, but because of his unique connection to his Father. You see, the heart of Jesus Christ was not his ability to do miracles or to be powerful. It was his identity as the Son of God, his simple and clear connection to God the Father. Everything flows from that. You know, this story actually foreshadows the end of the gospel. Jesus goes missing twice in Luke's gospel. Mary loses him twice. The second time is on Good Friday, where she loses her son to the horrors of the cross. And then 3 days later, finds him again, risen from the dead. And Jesus responds to some disciples that day the way he responded to his parents in the beginning. How foolish you are, he says, and how slow to believe. Did not the Messiah have to suffer these things and then enter into glory? You should have known, he said, I had to die, I had to rise. You should have known where I'd be. You should have known I'd come back. See, Jesus, the 12-year-old, is the same as Jesus, the adult. A sure sense of who he is, the son of a greater family, of the Father himself. All of his life is driven by his love for his Father, by his obedience to his commands, by his willingness to walk the path of childhood. From the beginning, he grew up like us in a family like ours, but he belonged first to the Father. And as he walked every step of his life in perfection in a way we did not, he could then offer himself on the cross in our place to give us the perfection of his childhood and his adulthood and his whole self. That he might not just be a son of God, but we might all be children of God. You see, friends, Jesus had a family like ours. He grew up like us. He summons us to a pattern of growth like he had. ultimately the only thing unique about him was that he was and is and always will be the eternal Son of God, who obediently walked the Father's path to set us free. Amen.